Thank you, Dr. Tung. I'd like to thank the three presenters for actually getting their papers in on time to me, so at least I could read them and then try to make notes as they amended them in their oral presentations. The focus of this particular session is on the relationship between economic policy and changes in national power and geopolitics, and I think the three papers serve well. But when I am critical about them, it's because they're so broad-based that we now need to get down, and some of the papers that follow on will do that for us. Starting with Richard Bitzinger, if you're going to talk about arms procurement, military modernization, technology in the region, he's the man. He's been doing it for the last 10 years. He provided a very broad overview of military technology developments and acquisitions, force modernization, and in the paper stressed this is the most far-reaching arms buildup in the world. But all his points about lethality, reach, etc., he's been making for 10 years. It's just the technology keeps moving on. That's not a criticism. And then a central focus on China's development for deterrence, counterattack, maritime reach, counter-intervention with the US A2AD, anti-access air denial out to the second island chain. Then he looks at the US pivot rebalance, is I think what the Pentagon prefers, but he uses that as well, and the shift from the air-sea battle to the joint concept for access and maneuver in the global commons. That's in the written paper. And this all sees the trend is not just force modernization, buying the next version, as I've just done on my Mazda, but new types of armaments, lethality and accuracy. So I'd like to draw Richard out on specifics. How by 2020 and beyond will the naval balance of power alter in the South China Sea? China's economy is predicted by the IMF to keep growing by 6.2% on average out to 2020. And how will China use that military muscle? We've described it, but how will it actually be employed? And what we need is to come down from the macro picture to the South Sea Fleet, the theater of operations that we're dealing with. But at the same time, let's look. Philippines' economy is projected to grow by 6.5%. Where is it likely to go from its very low base of the Aquino military modernization? And I just ask this rhetorically, to Duterte and beyond. And that's not, Richard may not be able to answer that, but I'm saying that's where we need to take this. Second, Vietnam is projected to grow by 6.1% to 2020. And it was the 8th largest importer of arms in the world in the 4 years from 2011 to 2015, according to SIPRI. Third is Indonesia, 5.7. Fourth, Malaysia, 4.9. Singapore, 3.2. But having said all this, the next question is, how do they integrate it? So we have all the little bits and pieces on the table, but can the countries acquiring that really make it effective? Real questions are asked about Vietnam submarines. We have even mention of land attack missiles in Richard's paper, but you need satellites and specific targeting to actually deliver them, to make them effective. And which countries that are acquiring them have that capability? What was the role of Japan, Australia, Russia, and India? And since Russia's doing joint exercises with both India today and China in the past week, that didn't really come out in the paper, their roles. And then for the regional states that are acquiring it, we need some more. What is their maritime strategy? What is their maritime doctrine? What is the network going on to take the revolution in military affairs and make all this kit and equipment more effective? And what are the prospects for combined naval actions amongst ASEAN or individual countries themselves? And then I want to end with a nitpicking. He mentions the 2,500 Marines in Darwin. Well, we know that's going to be solved very, very shortly, but it hasn't quite reached there. He mentions and quotes Kit Campbell about an increased U.S. access to Vietnamese ports. That's kind of misleading. It's not a access. It's in the same sentence as the Philippines, and the access that the U.S. had under Aquino is not the same. Then he uses the term creeping assertiveness and cites a footnote to 2010 And the author of that one was using that in the late 90s, and I think that's a very understated expression to use for what China is doing. But those are nitpicking claims. So are, as he says, South China Sea claims among the ASEAN countries themselves just as strong as among China? I challenge that. Yes, you have an Indonesia, Malaysia flare-up over Ambalat, but you haven't resolved. And so are the Philippine, Vietnam differences over the South K really as strong as the ones? That's the nitpicking. And then I go, Vietnam subs, that's just a platform. What else is it? You know, can they do with it? Then I mentioned land attacks. So that finishes me there. To turn to the second paper, Harry Krasja on international order, was looking at the dilemma between security, economics, and demographics. It was good that that was brought in, because that's a factor that's going to affect China in the future. And I think that needs to be brought out much more stronger. And that is leading to what he calls a transformation in statecraft. Power is being reformulated by demography and globalization. We need to really take that implication into account, because the slowing of China's economy to 6.2 already is having an impact on countries like Malaysia, because they're not being able to sell as much commodities in that chain as before. So we need to get that nexus. Now, in China's military modernization, he tells us it's there to weaken the U.S. alliance, create no-go zones. So we have Richard's description of the equipment allied with at least some objectives. Now, the food insecurity, oil and gas, I was more persuaded by the oral argument than what I heard. And even though the fisheries may not be important in the overall scheme of economic balance, as we've heard from two speakers, I want to go back to James Goldrick's comments from last night and the real look at fisheries. This is a human security issue of great dimensions. Yes, it's a depleting resource, and that's why it makes it an even worse issue. More and more bigger fishing fleets moving further and further south, and the depletion in stocks off Indonesia. This is the major issue, other than the territorial claims, that I would flag. Harry argues that the future security of the South China Sea is not defined by alliances or balancing of the U.S. and China by a network of interlinking, interdependent stakeholders. And I'm wondering who is the leader and how will it evolve? And the link between this and the last paper are the undiscussed. Trans-Pacific Partnership, if it goes, or is it dead? The regional comprehensive economic partnership that China and ASEAN promoting, and then the ASEAN Economic Community, which was the focus of the third paper itself. My nitpicking are that twice he mentions the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and that's my bugbear. It was a special arbitral tribunal set up under Annex 7 of the UNCLOS and not the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And I was at a conference in Yachang, and I told the whole audience, if anything, we should all go home and stop using it. Undermines our credibility. And then people kept using it because it's just a fixture. It's like land reclamation that I also reject. There's no land that's been eroded by wind and water out there. It's dredging up and putting it on shoals. Anyway, another artificial islands, you know, they're clarified they're not entitled to an exclusive economic zone, true, but they're also not entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. They're entitled to a safety zone, perhaps. Again, those are nitpicking points. There was a mention, then I added this during the talk, of a gray zone with the use of Coast Guard ships. Taking from my paper that I'm giving on the last day, just because China rejects the arbitral tribunal award, it's case law. It's international case law and out there. And I suspect the major maritime powers, wherever they're located, Australia, the United States, France, which wants to sail through here, will observe it and expect it to be complied with. So we have a problem. That arbitral tribunal pointed out the duties of state flag vessels, China's, in allowing its fishermen to do things that they're not allowed to do. So we have to really address it. So just because China regards the arbitral tribunal, this is a gray zone, the Philippines still could go back to the arbitral tribunal if there's a continued violation and ask for further action. So the game, in a sense, isn't over if they really wanted to. But we're stuck with, for the rest of the world, we can say the word arbitral tribunal, and how do we behave in that particular area with respect Now for the final paper, David Green's Economic Context, wonderful, looking at the interplay of competition and cooperation and making the great argument why cooperation, trade is better than war kind of argument itself. And he made the 3 points. Economics is depend on regional trade flows, and they wouldn't survive a military conflict. Wealth in oil and gas, he says, is not as great a winner. You put it in a better context when I read the paper I was arguing than the loss through conflict. And regions should cooperate for peace. Now, I read an article in The Diplomat based on a Vietnamese civilian analyst who used the words, because he was educated, mutually assured destruction in quotation marks. Basically saying, if a conflict breaks out with China, if and only if, why fight China gray hull ship to gray hull ship? All you have to do is interrupt the trade to cause the very problems you want, because the conflict isn't about military on military. It's getting the whole international community to jump in and stop it. So the very vulnerabilities, the very reasons why countries shouldn't interrupt trade could, if China uses its muscle, be used. And the article said, the further south of the South China Sea, target every Chinese flag oil tanker and trading vessel, not to sink them all, but to create enough concern in the international community, have insurance rates go up. So the risk is the vulnerability could be used against China. That's its weakness itself. And I think in strategic terms, it's rather frightening. On the ASEAN economic community, we need from the rest of you that are looking at specific countries, what about the internal stability in various countries that we're now witnessing? Thailand's transition, the corruption problems in Malaysia, the new government in the Philippines. And what about divisions within ASEAN itself? Cambodia as a member in its forthcoming commune and national elections in the next 2 years. So this ASEAN community needs to be unpacked, and how effective is it really going to be in achieving its goals? Getting to the now, we had the 8 wonderful lessons learned that were put up there, and I agree with them. It's interesting. China's trade with the Philippines increased during this problem of conflict. So we have to explain that. And in Vietnam's case, it has a massive trade deficit with China, but I would say that the new Duterte government in Vietnam already are beginning to address these problems. The recent visit of the Vietnamese Prime Minister, Nguyen Xuan Phuc, was specifically to get greater market access for Vietnam. It's for Vietnam to try to it can never end the trade deficit, but diversify and build up elsewhere. The US, Europe, Japan, etc. And they have identified these specific cross-border areas. China was pressing quite strongly. So some of the straws in the wind that you've been talking about are there. Then we really hadn't heard, we had in passing, but not the mention of the One Belt, One Road, Maritime Silk Route, and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So we're talking about the needs of infrastructure. And these are all on the table today. And big talks between Vietnam and China were on railroads and expressways for that interconnectivity. Ironically, it was a Chinese scholar based in Singapore that told us that, in part, the Malacca dilemma was invented by China's southern provinces to get money to build the infrastructure to avoid the Malacca dilemma. So they were using that. But then I had Abdul Goldnick in the audience correcting me that this is a Strait of Malacca choke point. And I believe he argued to me, no, it wasn't, because choke points really stop trade, but you go elsewhere, even if it's all around Australia or Lombok and Sumbac. Anyway, let me end on the following. If we're looking, I recall the works of Hedley Bull because the word anarchic order was used in a paper, where the roles of the international order is comprised of the roles of major powers, which we've looked at, alliances, but now networks as well, so those two fit in, international law, which we had allusions to, institutions, but he also used the word war. Every now and then you might have to use muscle, like on North Korea, if they got really bad, or that conflict to restore order when the balance is being upset. So we should ponder the mixed interplay of all those factors. As for ASEAN, to use an expression famous with Gareth Evans, it's the only game in town. One way of mitigating major power rivalry is to try to, is for those of us on the constructive side, I would have thought, to bolster ASEAN's centrality, even despite all its weaknesses and faults, because if we erode it and don't give it that insulation, it becomes direct US-China confrontation. So now I leave it for the rest of this broad overview, as we have the other papers, to test the empirical reality of your countries with the broad themes outlined for us. And I thank all of them, even though I may have been minorly nitpicking critical, the broad development of the military and economics and the focus of networked architectures, I think presents us with a good feast for discussion, and I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thayer, for giving the very good summaries of the 3 papers that were presented before him. Now I'd like to open the floor for the first round of discussions that involves Q&A. And the mic is moving around for you to speak, and then just show me your hand so that I can invite you properly. And then I would like to spend like between 7 and 5 minutes for the 3 presenters to respond to the question. Is it okay? So please identify yourself and make the point straight.
Thank you. I have 2 questions to Professor Jay Green, but I also welcome comments and replies from the other panelists. The first question, I think Carl Dreyer has mentioned about it, that the ASEAN and China trade has increasingly become interdependent, at least in the last decade or 2. But the question is, why is China's behavior becomes increasingly more aggressive precisely when the trade, its economy is increasingly more interdependent and integrated with ASEAN? My second question is that no ASEAN country, they have stated this, would like to see the South China Sea issue to overshadow its overall relationship with China. But I understand that this is a highly qualified statement. Of course, they will not ignore the situation in the South China Sea to blow out of proportion. But what is the red line that do you think ASEAN would say that, okay, we have had enough of this, and there must be costs that should be imposed on China, at least economically, because if in case they don't have the ability to do so militarily. Thank you.
Could you please identify yourself?
Andy Supriyanto from ANU. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes. Could I gather more questions or comments? Yes, please.
Thanks, Bob Lowry. I'm a visitor here, but my main hobby is following Indonesian military and politics. But I want to ask an economic question, which is probably beyond the scope of this conference, but I think it's something we need to sort of take into consideration. And that is, what is the impact of new and emerging technology going to have on international trade flows and the relationships between the various countries? And they can change quite quickly. You know, for example, the fracking in America has given it oil independence, gas independence that we would never have imagined some years back. So what's the impact of things like 3D printing and all these new technologies going to have on the manufacturing patterns around the world and the trade flows that come from those?
Yes. Have more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Andrew Carr from the Strategic and Defence Study Centre. Given it's the first session, I was wondering if I could perhaps throw a bit of a dead cat into the room and ask, to what extent does the South China Sea actually matter in itself, or to what extent is it a proxy for larger contests, larger debates about regional order, power and position? How much emphasis should we place on the technical aspects of it and particulars versus those broader questions?
Yep.
Thank you for the presentation. Liu Tuo from the Taiwan mission. Usually the discussion on the South China Sea issues ignore a big black hole that is the role of Taiwan. Actually, my opinion is Taiwan can play a very productive role. I would like to give everybody a good example. That is the fisheries agreement between Taiwan and Japan. As you know, Taiwan and Japan has Diaoitai Senkaku disputes in East China Sea. However, we could conclude the agreement without any compromise on sovereignty issues. So I think that everybody could consider to introduce this model case to resolve the disputes in South China Sea. Thank you.
Good. Yes.
Thank you. Excuse me, I'm Shah Hamiri from the University of Queensland. This is more of a comment to David Green and perhaps something that we can reflect on. Economists understand interdependence and its relations to peace generally in terms of aggregate welfare, so the welfare of societies as a whole increases with trade. However, that assumes essentially that the distribution of this welfare is relatively equal, or that there are no significant groups within societies involved that are actually not benefiting from these developments. But what we can see in the situation as in the South China Sea, as I understand it at least, is that the response of different actors within China is quite different, and that also relates to their own interests in relation to patterns of development. So for example, Hainan province is pushing for further increase of its fishing rights within the South China Sea, given that that is the area that it benefits from mostly, whereas Yunnan province, as you mentioned rightly, is pitching itself as some kind of a bridgehead into Southeast Asia, so it has very different relationship with Southeast Asian countries. So what I'm saying, maybe we need to disaggregate China or whatever country it is we're looking at, and get a better sense of who actually benefits from these developments, especially the economic development in the region, and what they're doing about it. Thanks.
Now I would like to invite the panelists to respond to the comments and the questions. It's kind of surprise for me to see more questions for you, Professor Green. So you have the floor first.
I'm perfectly happy to let my colleagues take the questions if they want. Let me take one of the hardest ones first. If China is so vulnerable to interruptions in trade, why are they doing what they're doing and risking everything? I think that's actually a very difficult question to answer. In my little book, I talk about the game of chicken. People recognize the game of chicken? You get in an automobile, you drive towards somebody else who is driving towards you. Really? People play games of chicken? In the movies they do. I suspect, in my own opinion, the Chinese government actually feels they are more in control of their economy than I think they are. The Chinese government has not experienced the kind of collapses of economies that a lot of the rest of us have. 97, 98, the Asian financial crisis was a humbling experience for economies throughout Asia. The Asian miracle had just been proclaimed right before that. We were on the high road to high ground and high development. Then everything collapses. I honestly believe the Chinese government probably feels they are in control of the situation. Asset markets crumble, well, put a little money into state-linked companies, that'll boost it back up. These things work until they don't work. China has become a more open economy. It has become an economy that relies on market institutions. It has been unprecedentedly, the success has been unprecedented. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. When I was a kid, what was the image of China? A very poor country. What is the image now? Getting on to middle income. Tremendous success. That does not mean there will not be problems. And the use of market institutions means that you are vulnerable to market volatility. Many of us experienced that just about 5 years ago. It's really an unpleasant reminder we are not in control of our economies. I don't think the Chinese government has had that experience yet. Okay. And also the game of chicken says that even if you understand the risks, sometimes you play these games. Is there a red line for ASEAN? This is probably something maybe other people could chip in on. ASEAN works under consensus. You need everybody to buy into any action. China has some real friends in ASEAN. And they're friends that have no interest in the South China Sea. So it has its block in ASEAN. ASEAN is not likely to find a red line in which they all move towards any particular direction, especially if it's against China. You can turn that around, though, and I tried to make this point, that Vietnam and Philippines have the ability to interfere with the way China is partnering with ASEAN. So it can be turned against it, but I don't see a red line in which you will see ASEAN come together, especially not in opposition to any particular Chinese action. Emerging technology. We have time for a beer later on. I think this is the kind of subject we get into that. But I will not talk about emerging technology. I know more than anyone does on that one. But emerging economic trends, I'm supposed to know something about that. China's economy has been the recipient of tremendous inflows of capital over several decades. It's helped transform the economy, develop a manufacturing industry. China's at the point where it should be investing outside of China. And the Chinese outward foreign direct investment is just about the same level of inward direct investment. Where should that outward foreign investment go? Should go to ASEAN neighbors, particularly Vietnam. I believe the tension over the South China Sea is probably preventing that process from going on. Economic trends suggest that Vietnam and China, they are tremendous economic partners now, could be even greater economic partners. But it will probably take a conscious effort to identify the steps, the policy changes, the infrastructure that could be put into place to allow that process to go forward. One more. I won't touch on South China Sea as a proxy. I won't touch on Taiwan. Trade and welfare. Absolutely right. Increased trade does not necessarily represent increased welfare for everybody. But I think it's true that the policymakers in general, all throughout East Asia, say trade is our avenue to growth and development. And they're convinced that overall it is good for their economies. The problem, and you pointed out, that decision-making is not necessarily one person, one place, one time. Decision-making in a country like China, any country, is different people, different places, different times for different reasons. Again, though, my main thesis is if we can encourage cooperation, if we can make it clear that cooperation has real benefits for the economy as a whole, we're more likely to empower the people who will move towards cooperation and away from competition.
Sure. If I can chime in on the new technology side to be very speculative for a moment. I've done some really interesting work with a company called Planet Labs, and they do persistent satellite surveillance of the world on a regular basis. And as I think CSIS has demonstrated with the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, high quality and recent satellite imagery has really changed the conversation around a lot of the issues around the South China Sea. And because of the rapidly dropping cost of space technologies, the ultra low cost industry for satellite launches, and the innovations in microsats and CubeSats, you're now getting a proliferation of not necessarily extremely high quality Earth imagery, but persistent and frequent. And I know in the case of this particular company, by January, they plan to have new images of every square meter of the Earth every day. and it won't be as high resolution as military grade satellites or Google Earth every few months refresh satellites, but it will have, I think, a significant impact on the ability to observe what's happening in some of the darker areas of the world's oceans when you have at least some form of imagery refreshing every single day. I think that things like that could have a significant impact on the issues we face going forward. And on whether the South China Sea matters objectively or as a proxy, I mean, to give you an unsatisfying answer, I think it's both. Of course, all these unrealized petrochemical reserves and fisheries and the key sea lanes of communication are all extremely important objectively, but also it is, of course, seen by China as its near abroad, right? For the United States, and I think also for Australia, the oceans have always been seen as a source of security and prosperity, and for China, the oceans have been the place from which every bad thing that ever happened to them came. And so I think that the desire to secure their near abroad, to have influence in the near abroad, and the ability to sort of exercise a veto power over developments there that they view as threatening to their interests are going to drive a lot of Chinese thinking around the South China Sea, regardless of the pure economic interests of it.
A couple of things. One, it's really interesting when you started mentioning emerging technologies and things, because I was just hearing something about it's funny when we start talking about the fourth industrial revolution, especially since the third, which was the first wave of digitization, information technologies, is barely 50 years old, and we're already trying to replace it. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you hear about things, not just fracking, but the idea of increased use of renewable energy supplies like wind and solar, and that these are things that seem to be taking off. Or things like 3D printing, which means you can decentralize manufacturing. Or one of the things I've heard lately is this idea of vertical farming, where you can create urban farms. And in fact, Singapore, somebody just told me a couple of days ago, that Singapore is striving to be 20% self-sufficient in like 10 years or so in certain types of vegetables. And there's a term that people have used, and particularly I recommend you to find T.X. Hammes at the National Defense University in Washington has written a book, and he uses a term, I think it's called deglobalization. This idea that, which is probably kind of relevant because now we're supposedly in the anti-globalization. A character like Trump is supposed to be the symbol, this poster child, for a better term, for this anti-globalization movement. But in a sense, maybe the technology is moving that way. But I don't think it'll ever be perfect. I don't think we're going to get back to a situation where, you could even devolve that down to us all being self-sufficient subsistence livers or something like that. We're going to be on the grid. We're going to continue to have to be interacting with each other. Nobody's going to be totally independent in all kinds of energy supplies. Certainly no one's going to be dependent on all types of materials. And I think there's a lot of limits to 3D printing and all that. I think it's going to be one more log that we put on the fire at this point, more than it's going to essentially change everything. Such as the first industrial revolution did not mean that we gave up agriculture. Okay, we still had that. With regards to the other point about the South China Sea, it's interesting, is it important in and of itself? Is it a proxy? I think it doesn't matter because it's become important in and of itself. And a lot of reasons is because China has made it this way. I've often said that if the economic argument disappeared tomorrow, that is, there was no oil or there was no gas worth fighting over, and all the fish died, and people were able to find alternative routes around, the South China Sea, China would still want it. And it's sort of become kind of a political manhood thing for them. They've made it such an issue that to back away from it, I think, would be almost impossible for them. And I think when you remember the thing about their passports a couple of years ago, which had the map of China, which included the South China Sea and as part of their integral territory. I think we've just reached a point where it kind of doesn't matter. What I think is interesting, and Harry kind of made a point about this, in a sense, it's kind of a touchstone in a way, because success there for their policies of enforcing sovereignty. Not to sound like the classic 1930 anti-appeasement person, but I think it would embolden them in certain other areas. And finally, to steal a line from Ewan Graham, so he won't have anything to say when it's her turn. But Ewan told me one time, he said, the interesting thing is that, the Chinese can switch between the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And, and it's sort of like if they start getting some pushback in one area, they can go to the other area. Is that more or less what you said, or am I putting words in your mouth? There you go. Thank you. He's not going to talk for the rest of the conference now. But anyways, but it means that also if they had a modicum of success in, like I say, this vaguely defined sovereignty claims, does that then make that East China Sea therefore look like the next tempting target? And I don't know, not to get too paranoid, but how far out does that go? That's all I got.
We have about 5 minutes before we close our section. I'd like to see whether we have further comments or questions. We haven't heard any opinion from our Chinese colleagues here. So if you have any things to jump into the discussion, you are more than welcome to do so. Professor Yuji, you have any thing? No, you reserve for further. Professor Chan. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
I will be speaking about China's perspective in the session in the afternoon.
In the afternoon.
In the afternoon. But in response to some question which raised by the audience and also the about why China is doing what it's doing now, which is apparently from the external view that undermining China's own interest. And my answer is that China has a very different view about this. And but I will elaborate this, in the session in the afternoon. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Chang. One point I'd like to have the panelists to go a little bit further is about the impact of the PCA rulings on all this, whether it opens up new opportunity for further cooperation, either strategic or economic cooperation, or it is really having little impact. So what do you think about that? Can I go from Richard?
Which rulings again?
The PCA rulings.
Oh, you mean the arbitral?
Oh, okay.
You haven't heard about that?
I was going to say, what's in Aleppo? Americans will know that one. Well, I mean, of course, the Chinese have always said, it doesn't count, had our fingers crossed, all that kind of stuff. Whether or not it actually does anything in the short run, I think is doubtful. I mean, it's not like they're going to suddenly say, "Okay, you're right. It was a fair fight and we lost." But I think it does up the ante. It does increase the pressure because this was all done according to the rules and international rules too. And the Chinese have always pushed the idea of international, supranational, i.e., non-U.S. Types of international orders, and for them to really ignore it really makes, at the very least, I think it puts them in a really bad position symbolically. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were more of these that are going on. The problem is, of course, is they're very expensive and time-consuming, and it may be that a lot of countries don't want to really poke the bear that much. But I think it obviously was one of those situations that left the Chinese with a lot of egg on their face, so to speak.
You said they're costly. Well, if you go to the International Tribunal of Law of the Sea, that's all paid for by the UN. But if you go to an arbitral tribunal like the Philippines did and China doesn't show up, you get stuck with the bill.
I agree about the sort of real symbolic but limited impact of the special tribunal constituted under Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on the Inland Sea. Okay. But I do think that events have also intervened to change how China would otherwise have reacted in the form of President Duterte. And I think that perhaps one of the few upsides to the good president's recent entreaty olive branches to China is that it's perhaps slowed down Chinese plans for the South China Sea because they might see now a venue through which they could get more of what they're hoping for without prompting more international tension and condemnation. So they might want to feel out what all they could get from the new Philippine president before they make any big new moves. Of course, they also have a prime period of time here between the U.S. election and during the next several months of transition, under which that would be also an attractive time to try and do something when lots of American policymakers are otherwise distracted.
I don't have too much to add. I can hope that this kind of activity strengthens the hands of people in China who wish to cooperate by letting them say, see, we get into trouble if we keep doing what we're doing. But I don't actually think it's going to have much impact.
So I think that we are pretty much on time with this first section, and I thank all the panelists for not only presenting the well-qualified paper, but also set an example for the next sections. So with that, I would like to thank Professor Bissinger, Mr. Keisha, Professor David Green, and Professor Thayer for your very active participation in the panel. And I thank for the audience for your comments and questions. So I would like to adjourn this session. Please give a big hand to all of us. Yes.